15th of 2021, there was a true story that happened. I read about it shortly after it happened, and it left quite an impression on me. There was a young couple that was hiking in the Sierra Nevadas in California, and his name was Jonathan, and her name was Ellen. And they brought their 1-year-old baby along on the hike, as well as their dog. But they never made it back to their vehicle. And this set off a huge amount of speculation in the public. There were a lot of articles and social media posts about it. People wondered, were they murdered? Were they abducted? Were they killed by animals? There were a lot of speculations on some kind of poisoning, just very unusual speculations there. But eventually, the authorities did their work and found the bodies and determined that it was something far more ordinary, which was that this young couple died of heat exhaustion and dehydration. Heat exhaustion and dehydration. They simply couldn't make it in the conditions. They set out on a trail that was an 8-mile trail, and it was only in the 70s when they began the hike, but what they didn't know was that as they were proceeding along the hike, the temperature would rise to 109 degrees in the afternoon when they were in the middle part of the trail. They didn't anticipate that weather properly, and they didn't take enough water. They only had a sippy cup for the baby and too little water for themselves. Eventually, they recovered the cell phone of one of the members of the couple, and I'll read to you from one of the text messages. This was sent at 11:56 a.m. The person wrote, "Can you help us on Savage Lundy Trail heading back to Heights Cove Trail? No water, overheating with baby." Unfortunately, they didn't have cell phone coverage out on this trail, and so they kept trying to call different people, and it just couldn't go through. And all three people died. The man, the woman, and the baby died, and the dog died. What also struck me was that they died just 1.6 miles away from their vehicle. They actually weren't that far. So had they been able to make it just a little bit more, they would have survived. As I read this a couple years ago, the story, I remember thinking, oh, they were so close. They were so close. And had they just taken a little bit more water, if they were a bit more prepared, they didn't need to die. But what was their mistake is they didn't properly understand the conditions. They didn't understand the terrain, the nature of that part of the Sierras. I've hiked the Sierras a lot myself, and it's conditions that can be very treacherous if you don't know it well. They were, in a word, unprepared. They were unprepared for their environment. I've been thinking quite a bit in the last couple of weeks. As some of you know, we just got back from India 3 days ago, and I've been thinking a lot about the time terrain that we are in right now as a society. And I'm convinced that just like this couple was unprepared and ultimately met their demise, many people, probably most people, are unprepared and are going through life in a life or death manner and don't realize how bad things really are. So what we're going to do today is we're going to continue in our series to the book of Matthew, and we're going to see Jesus tell us about the terrain that he was walking through while he was on the earth, and I'm going to translate that for us today. So you can turn with me in your Bibles to Matthew chapter 12, and I'll be reading verses 38 to 45. This is from the New King James. Matthew chapter 12, verses 38 to 45. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees answered, saying, "Teacher, we want to see a sign from you." But he answered and said to them, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, and no sign will be given it, except the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. The men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And indeed, a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it. For she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed, a greater than Solomon is here. When an unclean spirit goes out of a man, he goes through dry places, seeking rest, and finds none. Then he says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when he comes, he finds it empty, swept, and put in order. Then he goes and takes with him 7 other spirits more wicked than himself, and they enter and dwell there. And the last state of that man is worse than the first. So shall it be with this wicked generation. As a reminder, Matthew chapter 12 is mostly a chapter of conflict. It's this back and forth between the Pharisees and Jesus as they discuss various matters, as the Pharisees are trying to prosecute Jesus and trap him. We might put a title on this chapter of conflict and rejection. The first 2 stories of Matthew chapter 12 are about Sabbath and how to interpret Sabbath. And as you might remember, for those who are here, those stories end with the Pharisees deciding they're going to kill Jesus. It's a very important moment in the history of the relationship of the Pharisees and Jesus. After the Pharisees decide they're going to kill Jesus, Jesus retreats and he heals people, including exorcising a demon. When Jesus exorcises that demon, the Pharisees accuse Jesus of operating in league with Satan. And then Jesus responds with the teaching about a divided house not being able to stand. And then we saw in my last message that I gave here that Jesus gives an elaboration of that and talks about how by our words we will be judged or justified or condemned. So that's a little bit of the background. And this conflict between Jesus and the Pharisees continues in this passage here where the Pharisees ask for a sign. So now look at verse 38. I hope you notice that it says that these teachers and the Pharisees, they answered. So that word answered tells you that it's a continuation of what comes before. So it's a continuation of this dialogue that has been happening between Jesus and the Pharisees. And of course, what they answer is they say, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you. Okay, so what is going on here? You might think, wait a minute, why do you want to see a sign? How many signs have we seen already in the book of Matthew? We've seen so many. A partial list, not a complete list, but a partial list would say that, okay, in Matthew chapter 8, we saw the story of Jesus healing a man with leprosy. Then he heals the centurion's servant. Then he heals 2 demon-possessed men. Then the paralytic, remember the story of the paralytic being dropped through the roof. Then he raises the dead daughter of Jairus back from the dead. That would have been a very well-known story considering Jairus' position. He heals a woman with many years of bleeding. He heals 2 blind men, a mute man. In this chapter alone, he's healed a man who had a shriveled hand and another man who was blind and mute. Okay, so he's done a lot of miracles, and there's more actually that are described even in Matthew 4. The fact that he's done so many miracles, and here these Pharisees and scribes are saying, Teacher, we want to see a sign from you, it's kind of appalling. There are a lot of people in the world today. I've been giving a number of talks on the Harvard campus, mostly apologetics in various settings, and you'll hear people say things like, "Wow, if only God would like write something in the clouds, then I would believe. Like I need to see something like that, and I would come out of my place of unbelief." And they frame these questions in such a way where it's like, if I just had this, then it'll be great. And in fact, if you notice, the Pharisees and the scribes, they preface their question with the title teacher, which sounds kind of respectful, right? They say teacher, like, hey, we're here to supposedly learn from you. But this pious language, as I will contend, it's actually a cover, it's masking the corruption that's in their hearts. I will contend in a little while that similarly, the person who says, if I just had the sign in the clouds written, John 3:16 printed clearly in the clouds, like that there's actually something wrong in their hearts. Does Jesus grant this request? Well, of course, we know from Jesus before, when he was in the desert, tempted by the devil asked him to do various miracles. We know that Jesus doesn't do miracles on demand. That's not the type of person that he is. He does miracles out of compassion, out of need. When he sees someone who's hurting, when he sees someone who's in a place of desperation, of true crying out to God, that's when Jesus acts. So we would probably anticipate, based on what we saw in chapter 4 when Jesus was interacting with Satan, and Satan was rebuffed, this is a group that has already committed to kill Jesus. They're coming from a place of hostility, that Jesus probably is not going to grant this request. And in fact, Jesus says that it's a wicked and adulterous generation that asks for a sign. Okay, I hope we were struck by that. This question is met not with a kind answer, but he says, a wicked and adulterous generation demands a sign. In fact, ask for a sign. The word that the New King James translates as asks, it actually should be demands. Zeteo, but there's this preposition intensifier, epi, that's put in front of it, which strengthens the verb. So it really should be a wicked and adulterous generation demands for a sign. It's demanding for a sign. So what's going on with this? And why does he use these words, wicked and adulterous? Well, let's think for a moment about a person who is adulterous, someone who's not content to be with his or her spouse, and he or she goes and sleeps with other people. One of the hallmarks of adultery is ingratitude. It's a person who doesn't appreciate what they have in his or her spouse, and this creates a demand for more. The person is in some way saying, I want another person to fulfill me. They're not satiated, they're not content with what they already have in their spouse. This is what we see in anyone who's actually seeking a sign. There's something in their heart that's churning where they've already been given a lot, but instead of being grateful for what they have, there's this sense of, no, I want more. I want more. My spouse isn't enough. I want more. My spouse isn't enough. I want this woman or that woman. There's a very famous passage in the New Testament that is about how people already have enough revelation about God to not complain or object. It's a very famous passage, and I want you to listen to this passage and see if it says anything in there about gratitude, because my contention is that an adulterous person literally with their spouse, and here an adulterous generation seeking a sign, has this problem of ingratitude. So listen carefully here. This is from Romans chapter 1, a very well-known passage. starting in verse 18, it says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men who suppress the truth in unrighteousness, because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because, although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools." Did you hear anything there about gratitude? I hope you did. I see some nodding heads. Yeah, it says there that there's plenty to be observed in the world from the created order about God. And it says that his invisible attributes are clearly seen. It doesn't say they're barely seen. They're clearly seen. But the problem is that people don't glorify God, nor are grateful. And it says that because of that, their thoughts become futile. You know, it's interesting to talk to certain people. The Pharisees would be one example, but there's plenty of people today. You talk to them and you go nowhere. You just talk and it just like goes around and around in circles, and there's no progress made. That's the definition of futility, right? Futility is where you put forth effort and you get no yield, no return from that. And there's a lot of people today that you can talk to about Jesus or about God, and there's no progress made in the conversation. You might as well just give up. This is what is meant here by their thoughts are futile. They're just spinning. There's no sense. There's no progress that can be made there. So this is why the practice of gratitude is so important to cultivate. So my first point here is that instead of seeking signs, we should gratefully acknowledge what we already know. Instead of seeking signs, gratefully acknowledge what we already know. Now, all of us, to some degree, are going to have moments in our life where we question, we doubt. Did I make the right choice? Is this really the way? Is this Christianity thing really specifying a path that's this difficult? Choices that we've made about where we live, church, all these kinds of things. We can doubt these things. And sometimes we can fall into a place of desperation and say like, oh, I need a sign. Give me a sign. But instead, what we should do is say, you know what? Let me acknowledge with gratitude the things that I already know. And let me camp out on those things. And you will find very consistently that if you put that into practice, that will drive away the darkness from your heart. You see, gratitude has this reputation today of being something that's like, it's kind of nice. It's something that you find on Etsy. It's like some like little sign you put up in your room. It's this nice little thing you do that is quaint. But actually, gratitude is a weapon. It's a weapon that drives away futility from your mind and darkness from your heart. If you feel like sometimes your thoughts are churning or you're making no progress in a particular season of life, I'm going to challenge you here to use gratitude as a weapon to drive that futility away. The Pharisees should have said, well, okay, guys, like we just saw Jesus heal this guy with a shriveled arm. Let's at least recognize that there was some good that just happened here. And here was a man who probably couldn't work. Now he can work. He's so happy. His family's happy. Let's celebrate and acknowledge some good that has just happened through Jesus' work. But instead, what the Pharisees do is they demonize Jesus. Watch for that. Watch for demonization in your own heart or in the hearts of people around you. One of the hallmarks of a Pharisaical person is they demonize. They demonize. They make very cutting, very strong statements they have difficulty celebrating the good. And it's hard to be around people like that because it's just such a toxic experience to be around this kind of ingratitude, this kind of frame of mind here. Some of us this year read some books that talked about the state of being in the box. This is a term that some books use, a very, very powerful set of ideas. Where you're in the box means that you're trapped by your emotions. You're trapped by, it can be different emotions. In this case, the Pharisees are trapped in this box of envy or hatred. But you can be put in the box, you can put yourself in the box, I should say, by and how you look at people. It can be your siblings, it can be your parents, it can be your friends, it can be coworkers, it can be church members. And you can look at them in a very negative manner and build yourself a prison that you live in. And when you're in that position, it's very hard to recognize the good that that person may have done. Okay, so Jesus here at this point says, this is not a request I'm going to grant. These are wicked and adulterous people who are demanding a sign. And he says instead of getting a sign, they're going to get the sign of the prophet Jonah. And Jesus says that just as Jonah was in the belly of the whale for 3 days and nights, so too the Son of Man will be in the heart of the earth for 3 days and nights. Now, of course, he's referring here to the time period from when he was crucified to when he was resurrected. But you might be troubled because you might think, okay, Jesus was crucified on Friday. He was raised on Sunday. So that's 2 nights, right? Friday night, Saturday night. And part of a day on Friday, a little bit of a day on Sunday, and a whole day on Saturday. But 3 days and 3 nights doesn't work. What's going on there? People have gotten all twisted up over this. I remember when I was working Christian radio when I was in college, there was a speaker. I was actually looking him up earlier today, who was sure that Jesus was crucified on Wednesday because of this, and he tried to totally rework the calendar and said, no, it's got to. Well, that's not the solution here. Don't go down that path. The reason that Jesus can say 3 days and 3 nights is that a day and a night is an idiom, and it can mean a part of a day. Okay, it's a little bit akin to how if you have a baby born on December 31st at 11:30 at night, you get a tax credit for that baby for the whole year. Okay, even though that baby was alive for 30 minutes of a year, when you file your taxes, you can actually claim that baby and get a tax credit for the whole year, even though it was just alive or just born for the 30 minutes of the year. I won't go through this. It's more of an apologetic question, but if you want to look at an example at how the Bible uses this idiom, you can look up Esther chapter 4, verses 16 through chapter 5, verse 1, and you'll see the same idiom used there in the book of Esther, where a day and a night is used even for a partial day. Okay, so let's set that aside and get to more of the heart of what matters here. What is he saying? He's saying, okay, I'm not going to give you the sign, but I'm going to give you the sign of the prophet Jonah here. And it's very cryptic. He doesn't talk here about dying and being born again, being raised again. What does he mean here? What is all this about? He's, of course, cryptically saying that the resurrection is going to be their sign. But they're not going to get to see the resurrection happen in front of their eyes. So how's that work for them? They're going to have to inquire about it. They're going to have to ask about it. The disciples, of course, will bear witness to it. But then they'll have to ask, okay, do I believe the disciples? We know that there's going to be other false stories circulating around. The sign of the prophet Jonah, as manifest in Jesus, is going to be a sign that isn't directly evident to them. Okay, so they want to see something flashy. They want to see something like think of Elijah on Mount Carmel, right? Where Elijah like calls down fire and boom, it consumes all the sacrifice there. That's what they're looking for. And he's saying, no, you're going to get a sign. In some way, it's a sign that's very spectacular. It's the resurrection. But in another dimension, it's one that they're not going to actually see. In fact, even the disciples don't directly see it. They only get to see Jesus' body afterwards, in living form. So what is this? What is going on here? I'm going to contend that the way Jesus answers this is, in fact, emblematic of God's way in general. God in general, when he communicates to humans, doesn't do it in a flashy way, in a blow you away way, but will do it in a way that requires some work. All right, so let's just talk briefly for a moment about this. One of the most well-known authors in this field, who's just brilliant, his name is Blaise Pascal, wrote many centuries ago. And one of the main themes from Pascal's writing is that the most fitting, the most helpful revelation of God is actually partial. It's a partially revealed, partially hidden type revelation that God uses. Okay, so Pascal makes this contention that the best thing for you is not to have this like amazing blow you away type experience, but it's this partially hidden, partially revealed type revelation. So why is this? Well, it's because the biggest problem that we have, that I have, that you have, much more than ignorance, is actually sin. So if we had this experience of like God writing John 3:16 in the clouds, and he wrote it all over the world, everybody could see it very, very plainly there. Okay, we might know God's existence, but guess what? We would know it from a place of arrogance and a place of pride. Because we actually need, more fundamentally than anything, humility, we need repentance, then a diligent search to uncover the deep truths of God, especially about Jesus. That's actually better for us to produce the right kind of character in us. So would a spectacular miracle produce steadfastness, patience, diligence in us? Probably not. It would produce, if anything, a craving and the sense of like, give me more. I want fireworks here. So this is why, in a nutshell, why Pascal claims that the way that God has revealed so much of Jesus to us is actually the best way. It's actually the best way to produce virtue and character in us. So the resurrection is God's answer to a world that wants this bowl me over God. Does it require diligence? Yes. Does it require trust? Yes. Does it require making assessments of character, especially of the gospel writers? Yes. But the claim is that for everyone who's honestly seeking, this is the best way to produce the right outcome in us. It's a very profound thought. So Jesus is saying no to this flashy, blow you away type miracle, and he's saying yes to the type of sign that is going to require diligence, inquiry, study, investigation, figuring out the character of the disciples and those who saw Jesus. The next thing that Jesus does is he says that the people of Nineveh and the Queen of Sheba are going to condemn the generation that he's speaking to. There's an author whose name is Richard Ward who lists 8 reasons, I think this is very interesting, 8 reasons why the Ninevites were actually more responsive to truth and to God than were the Jews of Jesus' day. So I'll list these 8 reasons here. Number 1, the Ninevites weren't Jews. Instead, they were Gentiles without the law and the prophets. Number 2, they had only one preacher of truth. In Jesus' day, they had John the Baptist and Jesus. They had two. 3, they only had one sermon from Jonah. They have many sermons of Jesus. We've already studied many of those. Number 4, the Ninevites listened to a foreigner. The Jews won't listen to one of their own. Number 5, the Ninevites believed without a sign. Jonah didn't actually do any miracles. He just went out and said, hey, God's going to destroy the city. The Jews, Jesus gave them many miracles. Number 6, no one foretold Jonah's coming. All the law and the prophets foretold Jesus. The first part of Matthew talked about that. Number 7, the Ninevites repented after a message of pure destruction. Remember, Jonah just said, hey, the city's going to go down. That was his great sermon. Jesus preached grace and salvation. Number 8, Jonah wasn't mocked or derided. Jesus was charged as being demonic. Okay, so the Ninevites, by these 8 reasons, were more responsive to truth and to God coming than the Jews were of Jesus' day. Let's think now about the Queen of Sheba. This is from an author, his last name is Fletcher, and he says, she's also much more impressive than the Jews of Jesus' day. Number 1, she traveled through long distances with no car through a desert. Okay, so I challenge anybody to think about traveling from Ethiopia to Israel without car, without plane. I mean, boy, that would make the journey that I talked about in the beginning look simple. Number 2, she was a queen and could have pleaded, I'm too busy, I have a kingdom to run, and so many people I'm responsible for. But she made time out of her schedule. Number 3, she went to Solomon without an invitation. She was so driven by curiosity. She just said, you know what, I'm going to go to Israel and find out who the Solomon person is. Number 4, she traveled to great lengths to hear from a flawed human being, whereas here they had the perfect Son of God. Okay, so this is all very important because these 8 reasons why the Ninevites were more responsive, and the 4 reasons why this Queen of Sheba showed more worthiness here. This is why the Ninevites and the Queen of Sheba will, on the last day of judgment, they will be there. Won't it be interesting to see them? They will be there to condemn those who heard Jesus and say, what were you all doing? Look at what we did. Look at how we responded. My second point is that with greater evidence comes greater culpability. Basically, what Jesus is saying is that, hey, you Pharisees, you scribes have greater judgment, greater accountability than the Ninevites or Sheba because you had more revelation and so many more advantages. Now, thinking about the Pharisees, thinking about how they had greater culpability, I'm going to contend that today we have even more evidence, even more light, even more revelation that makes us even more culpable than they would be. Okay, so let me elaborate very briefly on this. Again, I do a lot of apologetics, so this is something that has been very interesting to me. I was recently listening to a very famous YouTuber who has an atheist channel. He was actually in Boston a year or two ago. I had lunch with him, and I was listening to him on his one of these YouTube channels, and he said, I'm actually giving a lot more credence to the argument from design, or the so-called fine-tuning argument. So what is that? The fine-tuning argument, or the argument from design, basically says that the universe is so arranged that there's all of these forces, the force of gravity, for example, the force of how electrons and protons attract one another. They're very, very finely tuned, such that if they differed by even a tiny, tiny amount, then the universe would not be able to exist. It would all be hydrogen atoms, or it would be some giant clump of matter. So listen here to one author who tries to put into a sense of maybe visual or some kind of representation for how spectacular this is. And I'm going to say all of this is evidence that just in the last 50 years we now have, and it's evidence that even non-Christian, secular people will agree with, as I'll describe. So here this author says this. He says, let's consider the ratio of the electromagnetic force to the gravitational force. Okay, so comparing this ratio here. If that ratio were to be different by 1 in 10 to the 40th, okay, so that means 1 with 40 zeros after it. So now let's try. It's hard for us to visualize that, right? So 1,000 is 1 with 3 zeros, 1,000,000 is 1 with 6 zeros, 1 billion is 1 with 9 zeros, but 40 zeros, I mean, how do we even understand this? So there's a person whose name is Hugh Ross, who tells us to imagine covering every square inch of the surface of North America with dimes. Okay, so we all know dimes, right? The coin. I don't have a dime on me, but it's a very small coin. So imagine covering all of America and all of Canada with dimes. And once that is done, you put on another layer of dimes. Okay, so that's a lot of dimes, covering every little corner of all of North America. Keep doing it again and again and again until you're at the height of the moon. Okay, so that's 238,000 miles. Okay, so that's a lot of dimes. But we're not done. Once you do that on another billion continents, the same size as North America. Okay, so stacks of dimes all the way to the moon on a billion different continents. Okay, now imagine if you just were to find one dime there that was painted red, and you had a blindfold there. Out of these billion continents, all these dimes, they're stacked up from the ground all the way to the moon. And if you happen to get the right one, that is the odds of picking, that's the odds of 1 in 10 to the 40th, okay? So that should give you some sense of how unlikely it is that this is just by chance. What we have today with respect to the argument from design is very, very, very powerful and impressive. They didn't know any of this in the ancient world. Just like if you were to see the Taj Mahal or Mount Rushmore or the Tower Bridge in London, nobody looks at those and says, like, what an amazing accident. Oh, the wind and the rocks, they just happened to, like, make Taj Mahal out of, like, just coincidence. All the carvings, it's all like, oh, what a great accident. Like, nobody would ever do that. Those are actually small compared to this 1 in 10 to the 40th. So today, we who live in the modern age have much more evidence for design, much more evidence for a creator, than they did back in the first century. Now, like I said, you can go to Harvard, you can go to MIT, you can go to places like that and say, like, is this right? And they'll say, yeah. Even an atheist will say it's right. But they'll say, maybe we just got lucky and there's like trillions and trillions of universes and we happen to get in the right one. And in our universe, the constants are just so precisely adjusted that we happen to be in the right one. You hear that and you think, like, okay, if that's where you want to go, you can go there. But that's surely an appeal to a type of faith that is far more demanding than we ask in Christianity. So why do I say all this? I say all this, and most people in the world today yawn. They don't even care, right? Like, there's all this evidence out there, but for most people, they're not interested. This hasn't caused some mass revival. This hasn't caused the professors of physics and the leading academics at universities to turn around and say, like, wow, we really do see all this evidence of God. Why is this? It's, of course, the same reason that the Pharisees didn't believe. It's a wicked and adulterous generation. We simply have not acknowledged what we already know. This should give us some degree of confidence that when we're out there doing evangelism, we're not telling people what they don't know already. We're telling people what they know, but they've suppressed. They've suppressed the truth, and we're hoping to recall it. Okay, so let's go on to this final section. Before we go to this final section here, where this parable about the demon going back into the person's heart, I'll just point out one little facet, which I think is neat, of this chapter. A lot of you know this pretty old facet of Christology. Christology is the study of Jesus, where Jesus traditionally has these three titles of prophet, priest, and king. This has been around for centuries now. And it's very interesting here. In verse 6 of this chapter, it says that there is one greater than the temple. Jesus is speaking. I say to you that there is in this place one greater than the temple. In verse 41, Jesus says that he's greater than the prophet Jonah. And in verse 42, he says he's greater than the king Solomon. So greater than the temple, greater than the prophet Jonah, greater than the king Solomon. So and just those three greater thans show greater than priest, greater than prophet, greater than king. So it's I think a neat little side point there. Okay, so let's go on to the final section here, and then we'll close on this section. So Jesus has now taken their request for demand for a sign, and said, it's wicked and adulterous to do this. The final sign will be the sign of Jonah. Then what he does, he tells this parable about a person who's possessed by a demon. And this person has this demon exorcised, and the demon goes to these waterless places. Kind of interesting expression. But the person who had the demon in his heart leaves the house empty, leaves the heart empty. So the demon comes back and brings back other demons who are even worse. Okay, and again, as another small aside, deserts are thought to be places where demons and Satan have special power. So even in Matthew 4, when Jesus is out in the desert, that's where Satan is. If you look up Tobit, chapter 8, verse 3, you'll see a similar reference there. Okay, my other aside before getting into the parable here is there is actually in the Bible a teaching from Jesus that you can be reinfected. Is that the right word? Reinfected by the same demon, inhabited maybe by the same demon. So in Mark chapter 9, verse 25, it's very interesting. It says, when Jesus saw the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. So it's very interesting. So come out of him and don't go back into him again. So Jesus here affirms a couple places that demons can come back. So you're not necessarily permanently cleansed. Okay, so what is this about? This is a parable that is explained by the last verse very clearly. But before we look at the last verse, let's make sure we understand what's going on here. Actually, you know what? I will read the last verse. It says, so it shall be with this wicked generation. So that's what it says in verse 45. Okay, so he's using this story about someone being re-inhabited by a demon, by a group of demons, as a parable for the generation that he's talking to. Okay, so what's going on here? So what's going on is the people were, to some extent, cleansed by Jesus. Jesus, we know, did a lot of demon exorcisms, and they were given, by Jesus' miracle working, a new opportunity. But what happens is he does these miracles, and instead of positively embrace Jesus, they kind of fold their arms together and, who is this guy? And they have this position of neutrality, we'll call it. as Jesus tells us in other places. We looked at this already. There's no such thing as neutral, but they think they're being neutral. And because they have a void in their heart, it's going to get refilled by more demons. So this little parable here is a story about Israel, about how Israel had this opportunity where it was cleansed, but then it doesn't embrace the Son of God, and so it's going to end up in a worse state than before. I'm gonna read to you here from an author whose name is Dale Bruner. He's got some good insights on this. He says, "The house is clean and empty. The person is religious and hollow. The community is outwardly moral and inwardly purposeless. Empty, clean, and all fixed up. Has suburban life ever been better described?" Okay, I like that. The house is clean but empty, religious but hollow, outwardly moral but inwardly purposeless. That's a good representation of a lot of religious groups. He goes on, "The warning of the return of the unclean spirits is a pictorial commentary on Jesus' earlier warning against neutralism. The person who is not with me is against me, and the person who does not gather with me scatters from me." That's in this same chapter in verse 30. Neutrality toward Jesus is an empty house. Unmoved belief in Jesus is a merely swept but unoccupied home. Mere interest in Jesus with no commitment to him is a house in danger of haunting. Okay, so that's what Jesus is telling us here in this little parable. This idea is told again and again in Scripture. In 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 20, it says, "For they, after having escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, they are again entangled in them and overcome. The latter end is worse for them than the beginning." So, in this parable, we see what is happening to Israel as they have got to enjoy some of the miracles, see some of the miracles without embracing him. But their final state is going to be worse than the first. Okay, now I'm going to contend, that was first century Israel, I'm going to contend that is the state of especially the West, not just the West, but certainly the West, that has had some kind of experience of, let's call it a cultural Christianity, but it hasn't become committed in the way that Jesus calls for people to follow him. Okay, so this is very, very important commentary on our day today. I'm going to read to you here some quotes from an author. His name is Dean and Sarah, who describes it well. I'm going to read to you kind of a patchwork of some of his quotes. He says, "The people who practice cultural Christianity are not atheists or agnostics. In fact, cultural Christians would be offended if described with such labels. These are not urban academics living in loft apartments who could articulate their opposition to Christian beliefs. These are the suburban cul-de-sac folks hosting a cookout to watch the game. They believe in God. They take seriously their Christian traditions, prayer in schools, nativity scenes, and Linus reciting the story of the birth of Christ during a Charlie Brown Christmas. Cultural Christianity admires Jesus, but doesn't really think he is needed except to take the wheel in a moment of crisis. The God of cultural Christianity is the big man upstairs, and whether or not he is holy and people have sinned against him is irrelevant. In the Jesus of the Bible, though, we find itself instead a call to die. Self-proclaimed Christians who worship a God that requires no self-sacrifice, no obedience, no submission, and no surrender are not worshiping the God of the Bible, no matter how much they claim to love Jesus. In cultural Christianity, we find the complete opposite. Unless one gets caught in the act of having an affair or having their hands in the money at work, despair over sin is non-existent, and many people feel adequately satisfied with their level of personal righteousness. Okay, so all different descriptions that capture different aspects of, in this case, particularly American cultural Christianity, but it's all over the place. It's often associated with multi-generational faith, where people have been Christians for many, many generations, and it's kind of taken for granted. It's often associated with a comfortable life, where people have money, they're doing relatively well off. There's often family businesses and these outposts that get created here. There's just this status quo that gets enforced and reinforced. So what do we do? My final point is that only a commitment to sacrifice and suffering can break the spell of pseudo-belief in Jesus. Only, I'll repeat it, only commitment to sacrifice and suffering can break the spell of pseudo-belief in Jesus. What is the age that we live in? Even more so than the day of the Pharisee, today is the age of comfort. It is the age of ease. It is the age that runs away from fasting, the age that runs away from suffering, the age that runs away from the hard task of the Great Commission and the cross. I again, particularly after my recent travels, I've been even more gripped by how dire our situation is globally. I'm not speaking about any one particular church or any one particular country here, but generally speaking, I don't think we appreciate the terrain. Like the hikers who went out on their journey, and it was a pleasant 70-degree day, they had no idea the furnace they were walking into and how dire their hour is. We collectively in the church today are infected with a kind of virus that is destroying us much more profoundly than we appreciate. One writer named Christian Smith says, all that society is, apparently, is a collection of autonomous individuals out to enjoy life. America has lived a long time off its thin Christian veneer, partly necessitated by the Cold War. That is all finally being stripped away by the combination of mass consumer capitalism and liberal individualism. This is an author, Rod Dreher, who's commenting on a philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre, who says, he argued that the West has abandoned reason and the tradition of virtues in giving itself over to the relativism that is now flooding our world today. We are governed not by our faith, nor by reason, or by any combination of the two. We are governed by what MacIntyre calls emotivism, the idea that all moral choices are nothing more than the expression of what the choosing individual feels like is right. MacIntyre said that a society governed itself according to emotivist principles would look a lot like the modern West, in which the liberation of the individual's will is thought to be the greatest good. As we close here, I'm going to contend again that millions of people are dying, spiritually dying, on their hike through this world. They have terribly underestimated the conditions, and they do not accurately perceive the conditions of our day. The way forward is through sacrifice. I hope to unpack this more, especially in some of our midweeks and conversations that we're going to be having here. Some of you know about some of the projects that I've been working on, and I'm excited to talk through some of these things. Everything in this passage is true for us, but magnified many, many fold. What are we going to do? As I said, this is going to be something that I'll be speaking about quite a bit. And the next sermon that I give in Matthew is going to help us with a remedy, but we'll have to stay tuned for that for another day. Let's close in prayer. Father, we know that we live in a wicked and adulterous generation, a generation that is captive to the lusts of the world, the lust of the flesh, and the pride and possessions, a society that is gripped by consumerism and individualism, in which to apply any kind of church structure without thoroughly uprooting these false foundations is merely going to be building on the sand. I pray for great wisdom as we sojourn through this world, that we would not make the tragic mistake of being unprepared, but that we would be well prepared because we are not unaware of Satan's devices. In this world of purposelessness, in this world of hollow religion, in this world of the form of godliness but denying its power, help us to go deep, to go very, very deep in our own hearts, to have the gospel securely planted in our hearts, the truth of Jesus be our shelter. I pray that you would help us to walk in great wisdom in this perilous time. We pray these things all in the name of the one greater than the temple, the one greater than Jonah, and the one greater than Solomon, our prophet, our priest, and our king. Amen.